Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast. I'm your podcast host, Peter Ahmad, recording from Cape Town, South Africa, since June 2019. The Talking Transformation podcast provides an open and accessible platform for built environment professionals and interest groups to share their reflections and aspirations relating to the transformation of places and spaces in South Africa. It's intended to be a celebration of the individuals and community groups who are supporting formal and informal processes that are addressing the challenges of South Africa's history and shaping the future of our neighbourhoods and cities. If you've listened to the first couple of productions in Series 2 of the Talking Transformation podcast, you'll know this has been a period of personal transformation for me. Just over a month prior to leaving the public service, I concluded studies with the London School of Economics, having chosen their Executive Masters in Cities course, as much for the course content as the ringing endorsements from South Africans who had studied in the first few years of the course. It was arguably the biggest career interruption since I started work in 1996, and very much challenged the conventions and my own limitations, whilst reinforcing some of the positives we as South Africans have to offer. And for all our challenges and our frustrations, we still have some of the most progressive thinking and personalities pushing the decision makers, and it's important that we don't forget that. I was constantly reminded of that as we shared experiences from fellow course participants from around the globe, from Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, Kyiv in the Ukraine, Chicago and Los Angeles in the United States, Sydney, Australia, Rio de Janeiro and Brazil. These were just some of the home bases for my fellow students. Like countless students around the globe, we had COVID, or at least the fallout of COVID, and all of its challenges as a constant companion throughout my studies. The idea of travelling back and forth to the UK 5 times was always going to be a financial stretch, but COVID and the global travel bans made sure that the medium for learning and tuition was online. COVID also informed some of the course content and certainly shaped the rhythm, the conversations we had between the diverse participants and their cities. Was this the end of cities as we knew them? What were the implications for socio-economic, spatial and transportation planning policy and strategy? And how responsive and adaptive were city governance models across the world to this latest disruption on an epic scale? What could COVID do to accelerate the climate change behaviours and responses, given the lessons that we were learning on a daily, monthly and yearly basis? You've heard a number of the debates on the podcast, and it was another thing to look at it through the academic lens. I wanted to sign off my studies with a nod to the course leadership, Dr. Savas Verdis and Dr. Philip Ruder, who co-direct the course. I wanted as much to give them the opportunity to reflect on their course, why a course on cities, the adaptation of the content and their own stories, as much as to give me personal closure on the learning and transformation journey. As always, I hope you enjoyed the episode and find your own inspiration for your next chapter. So it's just gone 3 p.m. here in Cape Town, Friday, April the 1st, and across the waters in London, United Kingdom, it's just gone 2 o'clock. Absolutely delighted to welcome Philip Ruder and Savas Verdis from the LSE Executive Masters course to the Talking Transformation podcast. Welcome to you both. Savas, let's start with you. How are you keeping today? Where do we find you?
Very well. You're finding him in central London in a sunny but very cold day.
Fantastic. Well, if the sun's out, there's something right going right for the UK today. That's good news. And Philip, how are you? Are you keeping well?
Yes, thank you very much. And I just returned to my office here at the LSE, which you know well, and past the increasingly crowded spaces of central London again, which is a delight.
Well, that's great to hear that things are getting back to some sort of normal. I know we've seen some COVID cases that have been increasing, but it's good to hear that there's a degree of normality coming back. Let's try and understand a bit about the two of you and your journey to London, to the LSE, the London School of Economics and the course. Can you perhaps share with us your own journeys, the primary interests that have led you to this space of cities and urban leadership?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. It could take a whole afternoon, evening to answer, but to cut it short, I grew up in a sort of semi-rural area in southern Germany, which actually is a hub of major tech companies and industry. It's a bit like a small Silicon Valley. So it meant you were constantly confronted by people moving into that region, Lake Constance, that have been to big cities and that were telling the stories of the big cities including my parents, who studied in Berlin in the 60s. And you can imagine that always these were fascinating stories. The fascination with bigger places existed from my early childhood. I then had the privilege to study in Berlin. I did work on and studied transport with a close relationship to urban planning and architecture, and also the back then emerging sustainable development agenda. From there, I had a wonderful year in New York, and it became clear the more cosmopolitan, the more international, the more rewarding was my engagement. And it was really around 2000 where London within Europe became the obvious choice for people working on cities, working on transport, thinking about progressive policy as well. Tony Blair just took over the government in 97, set up the new institution with the mayor for London. And then, quite importantly, the sort of more intellectual thinking around Blair's policies and the cosmopolitan ideal and the third way came very much from the London School of Economics, which surprisingly at that point set up a new program, the Cities program, with a master's in city design and social science. And I felt rather than going directly into the job market, let's move to London and really connect with this exciting city and the wonderful people. And in my first year, I met Savas, who was my teacher in the course that was led by Richard Sennett. So that's how we connected.
Now, there's something I did not know. So, Savas, you were indeed the teacher, the lecturer at the time. Let's hear your story and how it came to be that you and Philip would meet as pupil versus tutor.
Yeah, well, that's 21 years ago, so it's been some time. I kind of grew up in several European cities. What is common is that in very small apartments in central locations in Athens, Paris, and later in London. So we arrived as a family in London in 1984. I was 8 and went through a French school before then going to study architecture. And I gave up on architecture after spending my first year in practice, where I was designing a bathroom floor tile pattern for a hotel in Hong Kong. That was for the full year. So that kind of, told me maybe I should be looking elsewhere. I should have been more patient, of course. And that took me more to kind of, political philosophy and then economic development. And actually, I landed at the LSE with Richard Sennett, and I was his teaching assistant. And he was a second supervisor to my PhD. And of course, that's where I met Philip. And what was interesting is, the caliber of students at the LSE has always historically been very strong. So I was confronted with a very inquisitive and curious, Philip, who made my life completely hard. But that's where I've been here for 20 years, kind of constantly challenging myself via the students.
Well, that's fantastic. I say this is all news to me and fascinating to hear how the two of you came together there at the LSE in London. Let's perhaps talk a bit about the course itself. And again, Philip, I'm going to come to you first because my understanding is that through the Urban Future series, through the Urban Age engagements with yourself, if I remember correctly, Professor Ricky Burdett, it really started to frame the ambition and almost identify a need within both the academic space and within the practical space, more the executive space, this idea of a course that could be tailored towards the needs. But I'd love to understand from you the genesis of this and then how ultimately the two of you as the directors of the course came together and shaped with some of the leading tutors and names around the world to put the course together.
No, absolutely. Now, there is an important precursor to this experiment or the bringing together of the urban age engagement, research, outreach activities, and education. And that brings us back pretty much to 2006, 7, where it was, again, it was Savas who took me to the side. He's like, Philip, look, you're doing with Ricky all this practical stuff out there with mayors and with debates about urban futures. Our students here, at that point, graduate students, don't you think that they'd be immensely interested in that? And I looked at Savas and I are you suggesting that I should get involved in teaching? And he was saying yeah, sure. And we can do something exciting together. So we set up, and initially this was sort of a more informal studio-based contribution, but we set up essentially a new course, a graduate course called City Making, the Politics of Urban Form, where my role was really to to feed in the practical, the hands-on on the ground, and Savas in some way continued his tradition of high-level theoretical and also more political thought. That combination took off. It was really valued by the students, and we are still teaching this very course. So that gives you a sense that somehow stitching things together was a rewarding exercise. Now, this is about graduate teaching. And when we set up LSE Cities in 2010, as part of the mission statement, at that time already realizing that, there is a need for more coherent lifelong learning in the urban domain, we established an important mission principle for LSE Cities as a new center at the LSE, that it should not only do research, it should also very much continue engaging with public engagement outreach, and on top of that, education and advisory. The first test and trial was then an executive summer school, which we started running in 2013, in some ways as a test for the executive master. And in 2015, Savas and I were charged more formally to develop and then apply. This is actually quite a process, well, probably in 2014 already, quite a process to get sign-off for a new flagship program, the Executive Masters in City. I remember some really interesting preparatory sessions with Savas where we were both in India, in Delhi, and we were brainstorming about, with the help of also some practitioners on the ground, how could this be a course that not only speaks to people based in Europe and London, but connects with those emerging practices in a developmental context. I think there were a few really interesting sessions I still remember where we essentially established the basis for what still today is the Executive Masters.
So Savas, in terms of the main course components, can you maybe describe this framework that is still retained today, and perhaps in particular the challenge components, which seems to be such an integral component of the course itself, and seem to be so much enjoyed by those who participate within it, both those who are subject to the inquiry and those who are actually doing it as the students.
I mean, there's a few, I would say, guiding principles in the way that we've structured the program. In at its most basic sense, the idea that we are dealing with issues around sustainable development in its triple bottom line approach, where we're looking at what are social, economic, and environmental conditions or outcomes that we want to reach, make up the kind of core component of how the courses are divided. But there's a journey and there's a kind of program cycle, because we're delivering this over 5 learning weeks. Perhaps we can say more about this later, which very much tracks a project cycle. So we spend some time on analysis, some time on strategy and planning, time on delivery, governance and finance. So really kind of taking the participants through this journey. But what I would say is there are a couple of themes that really bring the course together. The first, which I guess started very much through Philip's course on cities in the environment, is the concept of transitions. And a lot of our participants are coming to the LSE with a deep knowledge of where their city is stuck in terms of unsustainable dominant systems, and how do you transition into more sustainable paths. And this theme of transitions is critical in terms of how you do it. And a lot of the times it's in the detail, it's in the kind of governance structures, it's in terms of the powers that the city have. But we also need to very much equip the participants, in one sense, meddling through complex power structures in order for them to realize this wider plan. So I would say we talk a lot about plans and strategies, but the participants are coming to the program are already very well versed about where a city should be in 10 or 20 years. It's more about how these good intentions or good ideas are delivered on the ground with opposition, with dominant systems that might be going against them. And so that is a kind of critical issue, and we have a whole leadership program that trains them and helps them towards that end.
In terms of who are your typical participants? What is their background? Where they're coming from in terms of a global perspective? As you've said, Philip, it was about trying to extend the reach of it beyond just a Western frame.
So there was some natural change over time, but nothing really dramatic. The broad principles of this being a global program was really established and maintained right from the beginning. The broad principle that it had the ambition to cut across the public, the private, and the third sector was also very much established from the beginning. Where we have seen a degree of change is if you look a bit closer into the professional background, where in the early year we had really quite a few sort of urban planners and architects and designers who are familiar with creating plans and working also with three-dimensional representations of cities. Whereas over the last years, we have maybe moved more into a policy space where participants also enter the realm of cities with an interest around policy instruments and change making, which extends far beyond the sort of core spatial practice. We are still considering the placemaking and the spatial question as the ground on top of which we come together. And we recognize that urban governance, of course, to a large extent has a very strong bias and also quite a few powers related to the spatial qualities of the city. But we have certainly become more diverse on that end, both in terms of our offerings, but then also the background of our participants and what they want to get out of the course. So you can see that in some ways it's almost easier to talk about an enormous diversity than sort of being very specific about what is then a key criteria of an individual to qualify or not qualify for the course. And I think the broad church of participants is very much in the spirit what cities are all about. You don't want to prioritize a particular sectoral perspective or a particular professional background. What ultimately matters maybe the most is a fundamental passion, which can extend into the political, about urban development, about the future of cities. And whether that's shared by someone who has worked all his life in IT before and never really worked on cities, or by someone who is currently a mayor, that's sort of a secondary question. What really brings the cohort together is this passion and a real desire to make a difference in relation to urban development.
I think if I can add to this, I think what is quite interesting with the cohorts. So when we put each of the cohorts together, we really try to get as much as possible a diverse sectorial as well as geographic spread. And of course, for teachers, what is very important is that you're not in a room where everyone is converted to what you're talking about, right? So we are always interested in inviting sectors that might not necessarily have been, I would say, aligned with some of the kind of, the wider, outcomes, whether it's a social or environmental. We've engaged with the car industry before. We've engaged with the real estate sector, which might, deliver, housing at low densities. And we encourage these types of debates and these types of participants to join us. I think it's extremely important that we see that, so much of the development that is happening today is unsustainable. And we want to engage with these participants. I think this is what makes the dialogue interesting, both for the other peers that are in the room, but also for us. I think this is extremely important.
I think that diversity that the two of you are touching on also extends to some of the guest lecturers and contributors that have been part of this tuition. Perhaps you just want to talk a bit about some of the people and the themes that you've tried to cover, whether it's in the political space, whether it's in the activism space, or within the sort of the think tanks that are part of the emerging sort of governance framework for much of the course.
Let me try and say a couple of words on this. I think irrespective of the sectors or the expertise of the external faculty that we bring into the program, we want to make sure that they are excellent communicators of their subject. I think what is critical in executive education is not only that this individual has done a lot of influential research, but also that they can communicate this in a classroom setting, being open to debate. And I think the participants that we bring in, we've heard them elsewhere, before inviting them to the program to make sure that this is actually happening. And as you said, Pete, because as you know, a lot of the challenges that we're working on in cities are complex challenges. There's no easy solutions for them because there's so many conflicting interests or even ideologies behind the different stakeholders involved. We try to bring as many different individuals as possible. So you have practitioners, you have individuals representing multilaterals, whether at the international, national, or regional level, other academics. So we're really trying to kind of, bring a very diverse picture in terms of the additional voices that come into the room.
I guess as the course has adapted, we've seen things like the climate change agenda become even more urgent than it was. We've seen COVID-19 become a major global pandemic, which impacted on not just the course, but obviously the whole of the global economy and the way that we lived our lives. We've also seen here in Cape Town things like the terrible drought from a couple of years ago. And I'm guessing that these things are continuously forcing the adaptation of the course content.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me combine it with the previous question about guest lecturers and what we refer to our global faculty, because in some ways, two learning curves came together. On the one hand, really working with a very diverse set of international lecturers to test the degree to which different type of contents and also backgrounds resonate with our participants. And on the other hand, then the very sort of radically changing context within which we're talking about cities. On the first, we through real experimentation over several years, we have now established a very solid global faculty, and that includes, for example, the executive director of C40, Mark Watts, a practitioner, or also Greg Clark, who is sort of a household name when it comes to the business of cities and understanding also the corporate side of the value of cities. But equally, a range of academics, Diane Davis from Harvard University, very helpful on questions of political tactics employed to move the needle where we need to get to, or Leilani Fahar on housing, and Henk Goving, who is the special envoy on water. So you already get a sense, it's very diverse in that sense around contributors from the Western Hemisphere. And on top of that, very consciously, we then had colleagues and continue to have colleagues like Jagan Shah, who ran the National Institute for Urban Affairs in Delhi in India, and an Indian colleague called Reena Vital, who worked for McKinsey in India for many years and advised governments at different levels, as well as Jennifer Musisi out of the sort of African context. She was the city manager of Kampala. These are just a few names to give you a sense that establishing that global faculty in itself and the key input they could provide was a journey and was involved testing and trialing. Now, talking about the maybe most recent demands on a program like this, and probably Savas already singled out the ecological transition, with particularly the climate emergency providing a major backdrop towards a very different kind of radicality now required for the transition. That's where with our partner C40, again, we were able, with our C40 challenges, to transition from, simply put, sort of broader approaches to climate action, really to a radical transition and climate emergency response approach as part of the executive masters. When it comes to the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic, we, from the beginning, had dedicated sessions, initially really just exploring with our participants what are the potential implications. Initially, there were major newspaper and TV sort of contributions suggesting it's the end of the city and the death of New York and London, which of course was a dramatic exaggeration. But unpacking that a bit more through dedicated sessions was incredibly helpful. And we're now in a space where third fundamental crisis needs to be added with a degree of elevated emphasis around the social situation, not just as a question of social sustainability, but really as, once again, a major crisis of equity, inequality, which expands increasingly also into questions of democracy and governance in cities. So we try to keep up to speed with those items by constantly adding within the more flexible components of the course challenges that speak to those particular issues. We are, as part of the discussions, the live sessions on the back end of the more formal lectures, bringing it back to those daily topics. And maybe most importantly, that sort of daily and new and the most recent demands. This is really driven by our participants. Let's remind ourselves how much our participants are a resource for the course, maybe even more important, a resource compared to the core faculty and the global faculty, because they are a community of peers. They are exposed to the daily new pressures on the ground, and that very fruitful exchange almost by default. And that's where graduate education is very different. You can't rely in the context of graduate programs that your participants, your students are upgrading, are in some ways also renewing automatically your course content, because they don't often have the degree of exposure to what's happening on the ground. But in this instance, with the Executive Masters in Cities, there is a default up-to-dateness, which even we wanted to work against it, we couldn't avoid.
There is many examples of what Philip just said. So this demand-driven approach. I mean, we survey the participants very heavily throughout the year. So following each of the modules, so this kind of teaching weeks, what can we improve further? What can we really look forward to? And they are actually asking, we need more emphasis on corruption. So we kind of brought in experts from Transparency International that have focused on this subject and why cities are such good conduits for corruption. So this demand-led approach is fundamental. On the COVID-19 situation, not only has this been taken as a core theme of the the kind of content of the Executive Masters, but also the modes of teaching. So it's been really transformational, for us in terms of how we've looked at the pandemic as an opportunity to completely change the way that we deliver the content. Now, luckily, Philip and I were engaging with online blended education from 2017, if I remember correctly. And this was in the graduate program that Philip mentioned earlier. And blended in that, we use a very kind of, I would say attractive is a good word, platform to make the content really accessible to participants. So people have told us that we're like mini BBC in terms of the production value of the content. So we in one sense put together this content, which is up to 60, 70 minutes long in a dedicated online platform. We heavily survey the participants on that platform, which then allows us to spend all of our lifetime together, whether this is in a classroom or on Zoom, really sharing ideas amongst the participants. So what we always say is, we're probably not going to go back on the old model of having one person speak to a PowerPoint for 40 minutes, where you can have a very interesting discussion, workshop, seminar around some of the issues. And because the participants are surveyed on the platform, we bring it to their cities. What does this mean? What do these wider ideas mean to your city, in Buenos Aires, in Rio de Janeiro, in Cape Town? And that makes for a fascinating discussion.
Philip, if we just come back to this point that Savas has started to touch on, which is this sort of hybridity of the course and the way that you're delivering it now. You estimated that carbon emission savings from those 5 block weeks, which on the one hand, there we were talking about climate agenda and ways to, and through the natural challenges through the health pandemic, we were having to curb travel. Can you tell us a bit about the results of that and how important that was?
The early periods during the COVID-19 pandemic required us to just adjust to 100% virtual. There wasn't a debate about what to do and what to advocate for. But it became relatively clear quite soon that the LSE would have a broader discussion about the benefits and disbenefits of moving towards a greater sort of hybrid component. And so with Savas, we, of course, made a longer list of the various benefits and disbenefits. And one of the key considerations was getting back to one of the biggest predicaments of a course like that, a module-based course of colleagues from around the world coming in within a 12-month period, 5 times to London. For the sessions where you had a 100% sort of virtualization, we calculated that for each week that would have been spent in London together and which we then virtualized, we saved between 70 and 120 tons of CO2. That depends a bit whether you're traveling business or economy class. So that adds up for the entire 12-month period to 500,000 tons, which is a significant figure. Now, moving forward, we are, of course, wanting to find a healthy middle ground here, taking on board, on the one hand, of course, this very important consideration around the climate. But we also need to be clear about that many of our participants are change makers around the climate issue. And in some instances, for them to meet in person has considerable benefits, develop the networks of trust, and coming in and maybe in the course of a program like this, at least once to meet in person is still a fairly legitimate proposal. This has indeed been a real driver for our motivation to also offer the digital approach to learning, not just as a temporal substitute, but as something which we really invest in heavily to make it work as good as possible and to make the hybrid work as good as possible in recognition of those environmental benefits.
I mean, one of the advantages, and there's a number of participants that we've been speaking with, prospective applicants. So we have conversations with all of the applicants, prior to them coming to the LSE. The blended approach and the hybrid approach, where they can, either be in London for the live sessions or stay at home, has been a game changer in terms of affordability for them. And that's kind of another big question here. So one of our big challenges in the Executive Masters is to get transformational leaders from across the world, from low-income countries. And for a lot of these participants, forget the fees, just the accommodation and travel costs were completely extortionate. So having the hybrid option has meant that this year, for example, 3 participants who are eyeing this program for the last 3 years have finally said, now I can do this. This is much more realistic for me. I mean, I guess, going forward, one of the challenges for us in the Executive Masters is to really make sure that we bring in the good scholarship help to really bring some of these leaders into this engagement process. I think this is a top priority for us, and we want to make sure that it becomes as attractive to these leaders across the world.
Let's think ahead towards 22-23 intake. And we've seen, again, more global strife. We've seen the Ukraine issue blow up, the levelling up becoming a big phrase there in the UK, counter-science movements becoming impossible to understand and disentangle the fake from the real news. So in terms of any thinking about the change for 2023,
I mean, you've kind of put us, 5 mega forces of change to kind of end this up with that. What I would say is, as you very well know, a lot of these debates are played out at the national level, but the repercussions are always localized. So whether it's in terms of refugees, whether it's in terms of leveling up agendas, the real work or how some of these forces are crystallized happens at the street level and often falls at the remit of a mayor. So we have always engaged with these issues and these topics, and are always there to kind of enable city leaders, whether in the private, public, NGO sector, to deal with these moments of crisis. These are huge turning points in one sense, but as is being said, cities are at the forefront of the solutions, and what we're doing is really trying to engage in that space.
Yeah, maybe just to build on this, and something which we haven't maybe emphasized enough, that the content of the course is, of course, quite centrally informed by ongoing research and policy programs at LSE cities. These, in turn, are directly informed by those present challenges. Just one example, we're running now for 1.5 years the Emergency Governance Initiative for Cities and Regions with United Cities and Local Governments in Metropolis, where we are constantly having, in some ways, new insights, what cities are doing on the front line to confront these rapidly changing circumstances. And this morning I had a phone call about exactly considering, as part of our emergency governance framing, the question of how the refugee crisis in Eastern Europe is managed on the ground by different cities. That always sort of allows us to tap into the latest research and findings and an understanding. And even those areas where we are not yet in the realm of having good empirical insights and understanding what is happening, we were able, with outreach programs like the Urban Age debates, to really pose some fundamental questions about what may happen and speculate with a range of international thinkers and doers, what may happen, what should happen in the future around cities given the uncertainties. And then we conduct surveys amongst our network to get at least some better understanding of what the collective thinking is about what we need to prepare for. I do believe that, of course, have to also recognize that there are ongoing, quite stable themes around cities, the role of the city's key infrastructures, its services, its governance, and therefore there's a robust skeleton and core and a foundation which the course is offering, independent, whether the latest crisis is now in this country or that country around this issue or that. And these fundamentals also, I think, help to ground this degree in a more sophisticated way, rather than an opportunistic running from one sort of firefighting exercise to the next one. So that's important as well.
So Savas, where can people find out more about the course and the work that you do? The admission criteria and importantly things like bursaries and so forth.
So there's a very simple website URL, lse.ac.uk/EMC. EMC standing for Executive Masters in Cities. Now, the most important link in that page, which I encourage all of the participants to look at, is the alumni network that it also includes UPIT inside. That's, I would say, that's where I always take prospective applicants, saying, these are the 120 or so alumni. These are the people that you will be learning with and learning from. Is this something that is of interest to you? So I would say, look at the alumni participants, look at their stories. And this is how we're building, in one sense, this community of learning. And what is important is that this community of learning is increasingly being leveraged through alumni networks. We now have a dedicated resource for global alumni. And this is where, in one sense, our story continues. And we're only at the start of this.
Anything you'd like to add, Philip, as a final words?
Just to say that we are incredibly open to receiving applications from candidates that are maybe thinking that they are not the most typical respondents to this offer we have. We are actually quite keen. It's almost the opposite. We're quite keen to continue expanding the diverse range of people that, on the one hand, contribute to the course. That's a bit how we sometimes see it. On the other hand, of course, then can learn from the journey we are offering to become a more solid urban operator or leader. Really important to not think that there are strong barriers dependent on, maybe a certain background over the last 10, 20 years. The criteria of a minimum sort of work experience is quite fundamental. The 10 years, that is maybe the most significant. And if added to that, there is a real desire to get involved in cities, to make a difference. This is a program you should definitely consider. And Savas and I will be available to talk it through with you and really hear about your individual stories and how these may map onto how we're trying to curate this program in the future as well.
Well, as somebody who's been through the program, who has had the benefit of 18 months of an unbelievable journey, I would like to, on this public platform, thank both of you for that journey and the experience, which has been one of the highlights of my career. And also thank you to you both for your time today. I know how busy you both are. It's been great to have this conversation. I do hope you've had some benefit as well. I say, looking back in a retrospective way on an amazing contribution in the academic space. And all the very best to you and the full team there at LSE Cities. And we look forward to seeing where you go in the future. So thank you for today. Thank you for the journey. All the very best to you for the weekend. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Pete.
Thank you, Pete. Real pleasure indeed.
We hope you enjoyed this content of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please feel free to give us feedback via our Twitter platform. That's @TalkingTransfo and the number 1, or alternatively via our email address talkingtransformation101@gmail.com. Thanks and recognition also to Tribal Need for allowing us to use their track Flags as our introductory and closeout music on this podcast.